So let's start with our first speaker. So Donna Bilak is a historian of early modern science at New York University and also practicing Goldsmith. Donna's research areas include modern alchemy and laboratory technologies, alchemical reconstructions of artificial gemstones, jewelry industry and environmental toxicity, and sustainable jewelry advocacy. In 2020, Donna co-edited the book Furnace and Fugue, a digital edition of Michael Meyer's Atalanta Fugians, together with Tara Numeda. And Donna's academic and studio work also intersect in a project that was very recently published in Ambix. I think it's the most recent number of Ambix, a special issue called Gold and Mercury, Amalgamated Histories in Chemistry, Culture, and Environment. And this also relates to the ethical jewelry line Prima Materia. So Donna, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's so lovely to see old friends and hopefully make some new ones through this roundtable. Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me to participate. Greetings from New York City. Yes, I'm a historian of early modern alchemy who's also a maker. I am a practicing goldsmith. The organizers, Sarah and Brigitte, have invited me to talk about my scholarly methods and approaches. It's given me time to reflect on what those actually are. It's a seemingly straightforward prompt and one that comes at an opportune time. I've just finished a big project. I'm ramping up a new one. I've learned some things. I have some things to say. And one of them is that history matters. And I think what I'm going to do is just take some time to talk about the project that I've just recently completed, and some of our collaborators are here. Shout out to Peter Oakley. It's the most recent Ambix special issue, Gold and Mercury. Gold and Mercury, Amalgamated Histories in Chemistry, Culture, and Environment, which was produced with support from SHAC. We got a subject development grant that enabled us to really formulate the project at the Lorentz Center in Leiden, actually about this time last year. So good time for reflections as well. But this is a project that it's an unusual project because it doesn't come out of existing historiography. It's a project that comes from the jeweler's bench. I was trained as a bench jeweler at a vocational school in Toronto before I became a historian. And my inner goldsmith really got reawakened when I was a postdoc on the Making and Knowing project, directed by Pamela Smith at Columbia from 2014 to 2018. And it was in that period that I began to get back into goldsmithing, and in ways that that project served as a prompt for me to really start making connections between the archive and the workbench, and also to alloy the two halves of my soul, if I can use that metaphor, the scholar and the artisan. And spoiler alert, I've come to realize that I needed to become a humanities trained scholar in order to become the goldsmith that I knew I wanted to be in my 20s and knew I was not. It does something to you when you think through making with humanities as your ballast. And the Gold and Mercury project was really my first space and place of experiment to really start pulling those pieces together. And it was prompted by one question, the one question to rule them all. Mercury-free gold. I wanted to use mercury-free gold in my jewelry that I was making. It's something the industry talks about at great lengths, but it doesn't exist. It's a unicorn. Mercury-free gold, what do I mean by that? Gold that has been extracted without the use of mercury. And I'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into that in just a moment. But in wanting to use this material and it not being available, it prompted me to start asking questions that it immediately revealed a Gordian knot of controversy, a humanitarian and environmental crisis. And when Bruce Moran invited me to be guest editor for what became AMBIC 70.1, actually, I initially said no. And then we had a conversation as I started really developing the jewelry. And I asked Bruce, well, if I do this project, I'd like to do it on gold and mercury. I would like this to be a project that's driven by my questions as a maker, and using who I am as a humanist and the network and community that I'm part of to really explore this problem and contextualize it historically. So I pulled together a fantastic group of researchers and authors that really span our community, from doctoral candidates to recently to early career scholars, to senior scholars, to myself, who I have an affiliation, but it's a part-time affiliation at NYU. So in many ways, I consider myself to be an independent scholar. So this project really shows the Academy, I feel, at its finest, and what we can produce when we work together and work across disciplines. But the project was really driven by examining amalgamation, mercury-gold amalgamation. For millennia, gold has been extracted through the use of mercury. They're actually chemically related metals. And when gold meets mercury, it immediately, they start to suck together. It looks like the mercury is devouring the gold. It's and it's because mercury is a liquid metal. The alloy that is formed is actually called an amalgam, a mercury-gold amalgam. Then you apply heat, not much heat is needed. The mercury immediately vaporizes and leaves behind a spongy gold mass that can then be worked or formed or reformed into any number of objects or uses. And because mercury is an element, it will do one of two things. It will either condense and settle and work its way into the groundwater, where it converts into a highly toxic compound known as methylmercury that bioaccumulates up the food chain and is in every single fish, mollusk, shellfish globally by now. Or it ascends into the atmosphere and precipitates globally as snow, sleet, rain, hail. There is mercury in everyone and everything by now. It has no biological function, and yet it's in all our biota and our bodies. Now, recently, in the last 25 years, there's been a lot of attention on a type of mining activity in the quote unquote global south, which is a term that I personally hate. On artisanal and small-scale gold miners. These are generally subsistence livelihood communities that work their gold fields in their regions, and these could be anywhere in the world, South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, other places. And they use mercury in quite staggering amounts. And there's been a lot of focus by the UN in particular in terms of creating policy that seeks to eradicate mercury. And our special issue really explored the fallacy of this. Particularly, there were two articles in particular, Peter Oakley's and the article by a group of scholars, Ruth Goldstein, Sebastian Rubiano Galvez, and Jimena Diaz, linking this, what is understood as a recent crisis, to actually no, the 19th century gold rush was artisanal small-scale gold mining in all but name. And it was the site of large-scale global environmental devastation that is still in our biota today. And prior to that, the Iberian colonization of the Americas was really the first major release of mercury toxicity into the biosphere that is not accounted for by the global north, which is making these policies to tell the global south what to do and how to do it. So it's a problem. These are untold histories of gold and mercury, how it shapes and reshapes the world around us. And the need to contextualize instead of valorizing through World Heritage sites such as Almaden, the one of the world's oldest mercury mines that stopped producing mercury only several years ago. So yeah, what the Gold and Mercury special issue does is it illuminates these hidden histories, these untold histories, these sidelined histories, and shows why history matters. And in terms of methods and methodologies, I'm also a co-author in this, and my co-author is an environmental historian, George Vertis, at Carleton College in Minnesota. And when we started working together on our article, which is what we've come to call environmental alchemy, looking at ways in which mercury-gold amalgamation mining has not only reshaped environments, but reshaped cultures as well, because extraction is cultural. And this was a process of two scholars that came together. And when we began, we didn't talk the same language. What we did by combining our disciplinary perspectives is we reached out beyond our knowledge kit, if you will, and by piecing it together, which really happens in Leiden, at the Lorentz Center when we convened as a group, by piecing it together, what we realized was we are trying to assess the totality of our relationship with the natural world and how this shapes culture and how culture shapes it, and how to deal with it. And one outcome from working with, or coming up with, if you will, a cultural turn in alchemy, environmental alchemy, is the understanding that as historians of early modern alchemy, we can look at materials and process and ways in which manipulation of matter and nature works, and flip it to apply it to an understanding of how an integration of an alchemical view, an alchemical mindset, can be brought to bear on sustainability today. Ways in which we understand that our manipulation of the properties of nature are also manipulating us. When gold meets mercury, the world changes because of their chemical affinity. This is not going to change, but our relationship to gold and mercury can. And this experimental issue, if you will, takes first steps towards that. So as a project, it's generated momentum that is the driving force between our group now expanding and consolidating as a consortium. And that's something that we can talk about at a later point. But in just wrapping up, yeah, this was, my approach is experimental. My methods and my tools are experimental. I am not wedded to outcome when I begin a project. Rather, I let the project reveal what the outcome needs to be. And that is shaped collaboratively and through community. And it's a community that comes together through care. We genuinely care about what we do and what our expertise is. And by allowing conversation that takes place over time to shape the project, that's how I produce. I think I'm going to end there. I mean, the one really compelling question and prompt that Brigitte and Sarah gave us speakers today: are there any particular obstacles or difficulties that come with your approach? Oh, hell yeah. But I don't feel this is actually the right forum to discuss it. And it's an invitation also to talk about the kinds of get-togethers we can have where we can really sit down and unpack that. Because one of the obstacles is actually the academy. the academy gives, but it also interferes. And I think on that note, I will thank you for your time and pass it back over to Sarah with thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. So we have to move on quickly to the next speaker, but I think this already, gives so much to discuss at the end of the session. So thank you so much for that. So next is Hasok Chang, the Hans Rasing Professor of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Cambridge. His main areas of interest are history and philosophy of chemistry and physics from the 18th century onwards, philosophy of scientific practice, and various other topics in the philosophy of science, including realism, pluralism, pragmatism, measurement, and evidence. He has published many things. I will just mention most recently the 2022 book called Realism for Realistic People, A New Pragmatist Philosophy of Science. And besides various roles and responsibilities, he's also a founding member of the Committee for Integrated History and Philosophy of Science. Hasok, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah and Brigitte, for putting together this wonderful panel. And thank you all for being here. Now, unlike Donna and probably Sofiya as well, I'm not going to say much about specific pieces of work I've done, but we'll try to say some general things about methodology, how I approach history of chemistry, history of science more generally. So the first thing I want to say is that my starting point in thinking methodologically about the history of science is that history of science is distinct from other areas of history. And there are many reasons for this, but I think most of all because it is about science and it needs to engage with the content as well as the context of science. And I mean, in a way, what I just said shouldn't be controversial at all. In another way, it's extremely controversial among historians of science today. But I think, one thing we need to remind ourselves is how some other branches of history work. So if you imagine history of art that refuses to engage with artistic content or sensibilities, that would be taken to be very odd, I think, right? If you had a history of religion that refused to engage with the content of religious rituals, doctrines, and so on, that would be considered very odd. So I think we do need to engage with content and context. And one essential aspect of what science is the pursuit of knowledge. So that we need to deal with. Now, it may be dealt with in a sociological way, anthropological way, economical way, but it needs to be dealt with. So my main preoccupation when I do history of science is to ask, how did we or how did the past scientists come to know certain things? And this makes an immediate connection with philosophy of science, which is where I came from in terms of my training. So, philosophy is always asking, how do we or how can we know X, whatever X is? And history is asking the same question, only in a temporal way. How did we come to know such things? So there's a close connection, which is why I'm always thinking about and practicing what we've come to call integrated history and philosophy of science. And my focus about knowledge and learning also obviously makes connection with science itself. So I don't want to go on at such an abstract level, coming a little bit more concrete. I want to think about a couple of methodological implications of that focus on knowledge and knowledge making. And one is that I'm actually in my historical work dealing with scientific questions, right? When I'm asking, how did the past scientists answer their questions? I'm dealing with scientific questions and how these questions were addressed. And what this generates in terms of the kind of history that it produces is a sort of problem-centered narrative, right? So I'm not looking at a particular geographical area or even a specific time period or certain institutions as my framing device. I'm asking, right, how was this scientific question addressed, solved, argued about? And this is how my monographs have come to be written, right? The first book of mine, called Inventing Temperature, was about the question of how people figured out how to make thermometers, to put it crudely. The second book I wrote was about how scientists figured out water was H2O and came to agree on that, what we now take for granted completely. So I think these problem-centered narratives have their own intrinsic value, and they can also throw new light on other aspects of history. And I can go more into that in the discussion maybe. And something worth doing, I think, is to draw a little contrast with the Kuhnian type history. So, you know, Thomas Kuhn's view on science was very problem focused, right? He said science is a puzzle solving activity. It's always about problems and how they are solved. But the way Kuhn approached it, I think, was to first identify this paradigm in a particular area of science. And he asked, right, what kinds of problems did the paradigm suggest to the practitioners? And he asks, how were these problems solved and how were they not solved, leading to a paradigm shift and so on. My approach doesn't even start from a particular discipline. When I ask, how did they figure out how to measure temperature? That already puts me in the midst of chemistry and physics, in the midst of engineering and material science and medicine and botany, everything. So following a problem around like that generates a very different slice of the history of science. And I think that can be quite useful, especially when it's put in juxtaposition with other kinds of history. So that's the one first of the two methodological implications. The other is how I end up engaging with scientific judgments, doing my history of science in this way, because I'm always looking at how past scientists have tried to solve problems, advance their own ideas, and the common instinct of the professional historian of science today is to say, right, we report what these people said, we don't engage. We don't say whether they were right or wrong. We don't say whether what they were doing or saying made sense. And I think we lose a lot by shrinking from engaging with scientific judgment. Now, I'm not advocating the, Whiggish imposition of current knowledge and belief on past actors. No, it's all about a sympathetic yet critical engagement. This is something that, for example, historians of philosophy or intellectual historians or historians of ideas have always done, right? They have the principle of charity, right? We don't start out by saying, God, that guy, René Descartes, was a stupid person. He believed all kinds of implausible things. No, we say, he must have made sense. So let's see how far we can get with that. And I think we do exactly the same with the scientist, which is how I end up doing odd things like really appreciating the phlogiston theory and thinking that it should never have been killed and so on. But it's an independent judgment that I think we historians need to try to reach. not judgment that's dictated by the current orthodoxy in science. No, our own independent engagement. This is something that I've really taken from Paul Foreman, from that paper of his called Independence, Not Transcendence, for the Historian of Science. And then one further implication this kind of attitude about the past of science has is about sources. What are our sources when we try to do historical work? And, to cut a long story short, our sources become just all the sources that scientists had, as well as our historians' peculiar sources. So that to me includes experiments. That's the context in which I try to reproduce certain past experiments. And I know Donna's been deeply involved in the replication work. We approach it from very similar yet different perspectives. So just to wrap up, if we're looking to the future, I think one thing to remember is that the relevance of the history of science is inseparable from the relevance of science itself. And the history of science, I think, should address all aspects of science and try to bring historical perspectives to all aspects of current science, which include research and teaching, public engagement, applications. And this kind of perspective, I think, has a lot to say about where it is that we're going to find our future colleagues, our future practitioners of history of science, chemistry, and where we're going to find our audiences for our work. And I think when we look at all the people in society who engage in one way or another with science, everything from consumers of popular science to practicing scientists to the actual victims of science gone wrong, I think we have a really broad and important set of audiences for our work. So I've already gone over 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hasok. This, again, gives a lot of ideas for discussion. But for now, we will move on to the next speaker. So Sofiya Kamalova is a PhD student at the López Piñero Inter-University Institute for Science Studies. She holds a bachelor's degree in Arabic and Islamic studies from the University of Alicante, a master's degree in history of science and scientific communication, also from Alicante, and an advanced master's in bioethics from the KU Leuven. Her thesis is about Ardestil case, a case of industrial intoxication due to plastic paints used for textile airbrushing in Spain during the 1990s. And she approaches that topic from multiple perspectives, including also using oral history methodology to conduct interviews with different stakeholders involved in this case. Sofiya, thank you so much as well to you for joining us. And please go ahead.
Thank you very much to Sarah and to Brigitte for organizing these conversations with science. My research is about toxic environments, and they have a very long history, and there's vast amount of literature that studies numerous settings from different perspectives, such as the history of occupational health, environmental history, but also history of science, specifically history of chemistry and toxicology. And today I wanted to talk about this intersection of oral history and history of chemistry. The methodological literature about oral history is very vast. There are many scholars who have written very good material, articles, manuals, and handbooks. And today I will just cover some of the aspects of oral history I found important and useful for my work. And here you can see examples of two well-known works that used oral history sources to study topics of Toxic Environments and Industrialism. The first is Biography of an Industrial Town, Terni in Italy, by Alessandro Portelli, which tells the story of an industrial town and the crisis of the labor movement by means of oral history. He collected over 200 voices of 5 generations. And the second book is Surviving Bhopal by Suropa Mukherjee, and I really hope I pronounce it at least decently. And in this book, the author uses oral testimonials of the affected community and analyzes the cause and consequence of the disaster from the perspective of the affecting population. And these are just some of the examples of historians using oral history sources in the theme of toxic environments. And oral history is a very valuable source. It provides alternative sources and gives voice to different groups, allowing to approach toxic environments from another perspective. And indeed, in Europe, oral history has a long tradition of affiliation to the leftist wing and to the idea of history from below. One of the key objectives of oral history was to present people whose voices have an immense value for understanding of our past, but are usually not recorded. But oral history is not only about history from below. It can be used to expand the boundaries of historic research, to study legislation changes, such as the study of the Toxic Substance Control Act. It's an oral history project at Science History Institute, where they recorded interviews for the people who participated in the creation of this act. Or as the example of Biography of an Industrial Town, which uses oral history to study a place. The true value of oral history sources lies in its humane aspects. They can reveal the meaning of the event, thoughts and hopes and expectations that are rarely documented in written sources that most historians use. Contradictory oral testimony has forced interviewers to re-examine the written sources and sometimes allow them to documents they might not have consulted or that the archives have not collected. More than one oral historian has also been rewarded with documents from personal archives of the interviewees. So the information gained from interviews can force historians to rethink what they thought they knew, and there will often be unexpected discrepancies between the written and oral sources. So oral sources are rich and offer abundant information that cannot be found in written documents. However, they are very complex sources that require meticulous analysis, that checks and criticizes the data obtained. So therefore, facts from oral history sources should be verified by other documents. Moreover, interviews have actually a long history of widely used tools for research among journalists and social scientists who perform qualitative studies. Interviews have also been used as a teaching tools, both at school and in universities. There's a lot of potential to them. What makes oral history interview different is that they are created to form parts of an archive. They should be shared. There are also many legal aspects involved that vary according to the project or country. So if anyone is interested or is already using oral history interviews, it is always good to do some additional training. I personally did an oral history course at Inter-University Institute López Piñero with David Berloghi, and also an online oral history course at Science History Institute organized by David Caruso. And if I'm not mistaken, Science History Institute organizes these courses twice a year, so you can register. And my research, yes. I will first briefly introduce a bit the case and then the interviews that I did. So I study a case of workplace poisoning with textile paints at the end of 20th century. The workplace poisoning with these paint products led to 2 outbreaks of respiratory disease, later named as a distal syndrome. On the map, you can see the two places. The first one was in Cocentaina, Alcor region in Spain, and the second in Tlemcen, close to Oran in Argelia. So most reported symptoms of distal syndrome were productive cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, weight loss, and nose bleeding. Several epidemiological and toxicological studies link these outbreaks with the spraying of 3-component paints produced by Bayer, and the spraying technique introduced new forms of toxic exposures through the respiratory system in a setting without appropriate preventive measures. That means absence of adequate local ventilation, the lack of smoke and gas extractors, and lack of protective personal equipment that would prevent the inhalation of aerosols formed by this new technique. The first victim of distal syndrome died in February 1992 at the Alicante hospital before it was established that distal syndrome is an interstitial lung disease that can be treated with corticosteroids. So according to the official epidemiological study carried out in Spain, a total of 257 working people were exposed to the dangers of textile airbrushing. 71 presented symptoms of respiratory affection, and 6 of them lost their lives due to clinical complications. Distal syndrome is one of many new diseases that appeared with the rise and development of the toxicity industry. And it raises many issues, including safety at the workplace, invisible toxicity, regulation of toxic products, challenges of occupational medicine, and questions of expertise and uncertainty. As part of my research, I carried out at the moment 4 oral history interviews. And if everything goes well, I will probably do some more once I return to Spain. And all the interviews were approximately 1 hour long. I tried to make them in person, or at least have an in-person meeting. I would first contact the person by message or email to arrange the interview, explain them the project, where I'm coming from. And before the interview, I would send them like a provisional list of questions, but the interviews, they were semi-structured. So the questions were meant to guide the conversation without restricting it. Like I also prepared a document explaining a bit how the interviews go, that they always have the right not to talk about something or later edit the transcripts if they wish to. And after the interview, I would transcribe it myself and send a copy of the transcription to the interviewee in case they want to change something. For the moment, they haven't expressed an interest in changing anything. And also very important, I will ask the interviewees to sign informed consent form before the interview to make sure that I would be able to use it for research. And my first interview was with Gemma Martinez Richard. I did 2 interviews with her. And she's an ex-worker of Distil, and she also is an author of an autobiographical book, 25 years after a Distil case, where she talks about her experience of working there and the illness of Distil syndrome and how she felt and everything what happened. So I first bought the book, and then through a newspaper article, I contacted the journalist and asked her how she contacted them. And then I contacted Gemma Martinez through Facebook. And she was very open and very excited to do the interview. She shared a lot of information. In the second interview, I also entered some of the details. She showed some of her personal documents from the case, photographs, and also she prepared like a book for one of her friends, and she had also a copy which collected the newspaper articles about her Distil case. So it's very interesting how she just cut all the newspapers and scanned them and prepared this very well organized book, and that's a very valuable source. The second interview was with Benoit Nemery. He's a medical doctor specialized in occupational medicine. He obtained a PhD in toxicology in England at Medical Research Council and was working in Catholic University Leuven, Belgium since 1987. Different positions, and currently he is Professor Emeritus, and he also keeps his medical practice, but only once a week. He co-authored many publications about distal syndrome, and I contacted him through the university, through his institutional email. Because of a misunderstanding, we had an interview online, but later I was able to visit him at his office, and he also had a lot of documents from his time when he was working with distal syndrome. This interview is a very valuable source. It reveals information about the involvement of Bayer company and everything that's happened behind those toxicological published articles, the connections and network between the scientists and how this research actually appeared. How did they find this case and decided to study it? And he in this personal archives, there was a lot of information, the unpublished lab report from Bayer, technical data sheets from the paints, correspondence between the scientists, data, toxicological and epidemiological data, x-rays of the patients from Algeria. So this information, this archive is now donated to the archive of Institute López Piñero. It will be processed and form part of the collection. And this are just some of the examples how through oral history interviews, I was able to recover this humane part, the networking, interactions, what people experienced in our distal case, but also access very valuable written sources. So in conclusion, I can only emphasize on the value and the potential of oral history. There are many possibilities to use oral history within the history of science. And now with technology developments, it is also more accessible than ever. You can do interviews online. And there are many examples of very interesting oral history projects, and I personally found it quite useful for my research. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So yeah, thanks, Sofiya, and thank you again to all three speakers for giving us such interesting reflections on this topic from different angles. So I don't want to monopolize the microphone too much. Does anyone have a question or a comment to start off the general discussion? I know there was so much here that we can dive into, and we only have 9 minutes left. Okay, so I don't see any hands. Let me just check that. Oh, yes, Guillermo. And then Gary, yeah. So Guillermo, please go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the nice experiences that you have shared. And I have a general question for the three of you, and it's about the role of computation and digital humanities in the unfolding of the history of chemistry. What's your opinion about that?
Who would like to start? From the speakers. Hasok, I saw you unmuted your.
No, yeah.
Right.
No, hi, Guillermo. Good to see you. And I mean, I've personally not used the advanced tools of digital humanities much. Of course, we all benefit from the databases and the enormous quantity now of scanned books and papers that we have available. But I mean, I'll just say that I think it has certainly enormously helped us to widen our views and in many ways democratize the field, right? Because only a few people used to be able to access these archives in far corners of the world. And now that's really much more opened up. But other than that, I don't think I have a particular wisdom to share. So I'll hand over to Sofiya and Donna.
Yeah, there's different ways that I feel I can address your question, Guillermo, and thank you for it. It's an important one. From the two offerings I have are as a user and as a maker. Tara Numedal and I co-edited the digital edition of Atalantifugians, which came out in 2020. And my experience with that project was ways in which a born digital edition that is a book that is created to exist electronically can work to dissolve disciplinary boundaries. Atalantifugians is a 17th century musical alchemical emblem book, which encodes alchemical theory and practice using music, image, and text. And Meyer was a polymath, but many of us today are not. So in order to unpack the riches of Atalantifugians, it required a collaborative effort of experts in various different disciplines that the digital space was uniquely suited to dissolve disciplinary boundaries. So I think that that's an example of a project that really works the digital availabilities to great advantage in service of providing a scholarly resource that can be used by various people with various degrees of expertise and also lacking expertise. So that's one way. That's one answer to your question. On the other side of the spectrum, from my most recent project, I'm really struggling with open access. I have an amazing special issue that is only partially open access. 2 of the 4 articles are not. And when you look at, 2 of the articles are open access, 2 of the articles are not. And when you look at the metrics for those that are open access, they're through the roof. They're by now numbering, it's pushing 2,000 views. The 2 that are not open access are hovering around 80 views. The 2 that are not open access are not open access because there's no institutional funding to foot the $3,000 bill to make them open access. Yeah. So there's some problems. Like in one sense, our research is driven by being able to access these articles, but then as an author, my work is being hampered because it's behind a firewall because I have to cough up $3,000 because NYU doesn't pay adjuncts. So it's, in one sense, the digital realm is amazing and in a very important sandbox for all of us to play in. And on the other hand, there are some significant barriers still to deal and contend with. So that's my way of answering your excellent and provocative question.
Sofiya, would you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I could say like regarding to digital humanities, there's a bit of debate and a lot of work to make oral history interviews accessible online, to create this online platforms. At Science History Institute, they have a lot of interviews in open access, very accessible, easy to read, easy to understand. But it's not always possible. It's quite expensive, requires a lot of work to do, and also the issue of privacy. So there are many challenges to that, though I do believe it should be the goal, at least, to try to put some parts of the interviews online and make them more accessible. But yes, wouldn't be able to I personally don't have experience, so I'm not the person to talk about that.
Thank you for your answers. Gary, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, this is directed largely for Donna. There's another project which is now in print. It's a large book called Antimony. I was the historian on the project, but it's like 25 chapters covering all aspects of antimony, one of which, of course, is its use in the processing of gold. So the book is available, and you can get it, buy it on Amazon if you want. But if you need a particular chapter or something, I can probably give it to you, since you might want it for your own use and not want to have to pay the expensive price for the book. So I'll put my email in the chat so you can pick it up if you want any of the chapters from that book, and I can send you the table of contents so you can get some kind of context on that.
Thank you so much, Gary. I appreciate that.
Okay, since I don't see any other hands, and we do have 1 minute left, I just wanted to ask a general question also for the three speakers. So in preparing for this series, we were also so one of the questions that we're also asking is kind of the future of the field, and Jennifer Rampling has a great article about 5 years ago on the future of the history of chemistry, and she kind of notes that there are a few trends, and the kind of conclusion is that perhaps the future of the history of chemistry is not irrelevance but ubiquity, so that it kind of can make all these connections with different kinds of fields and infiltrate into all kinds of areas of study. And I think your three reflections also really link into that, because you really show how chemistry has all these links with other kinds of fields, how chemicals are all around us in the rest of the world that's not just sort of inside the laboratory. So I just, this might be a difficult question, but if you could give a very brief, and I'm sorry for going a little bit over time, but if you could give a very brief reflection on what chemistry specifically contributes, or does it make sense for you to speak of it as a history of alchemy and chemistry as a separate field, or do you sort of see it becoming completely interdisciplinary in the future? If you have any thoughts on that.
I mean, just very briefly, I think we need both a return to chemistry in its core sense and pursuit of all its connections with other fields. And it reminds me of Linus Pauling declaring that chemistry was the central science. And I think that's something we want to remember. And when you look at, the size of chemistry as a scientific field, which is huge, and the size of history of chemistry within the history of science, which is tiny, there is something that's going wrong. So I think we need to think about that.
Thank you. Donna and Sofiya, would you like to add anything?
I think Hasok summed it up really nicely. My offering would be The contextualization of the history of chemistry is really important. And maybe Sofiya can talk about the role of science communication in that, because I think that it's a really important and integral element to policymaking. Knowing the history and knowing the context is crucial.
Thank you. Sofiya?
Yeah, I agree to what Hasok and Donna said. It is very important as a field and communicate our research and show the value is key at the end, because then that's the whole point of the research, to show what it's all about and the new discoveries and how the ideas change. So perhaps the future lies in putting more effort to make this in somehow niche field of history known among other disciplines. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. And thank you so much again as well for your fascinating contributions earlier in the discussion. So unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today. An hour goes by very quickly. Yeah, so please join me in thanking our speakers again with the little Zoom applause. And our next online meetings will be on June 1st, June 15th, and June 29th. So every 2 weeks exactly at the same time. And there will also be an in-person discussion next week at the History of Chemistry conference in Vilnius, if anyone is going there. So yeah, we hope to see you next time. And in the meantime, please, keep the discussion going online and offline. And thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Bye. Thank you all.